I'm Susan Halfpenny. I'm Head of Research and Learning Information Services at the University of Aberdeen, and I'm joined by colleagues at the University of York.
Hello, my name's Siobhan Dunlop. I work in the Digital Inclusion Skills and Creativity team at the University of York.
And I'm Steph Jesper, and just like Siobhan, I do exactly the same thing.
So with that, I think we're ready to start our talk on, as I've said, why is everyone suddenly talking about AI?
Yeah, so why is everyone suddenly talking about AI? I thought that just to check that people are suddenly talking about AI, I would do a little bit of research. And I asked a newspaper archive whether we were suddenly talking about AI, because I did a little search for the term AI in the headlines of UK newspapers, and here's the graph. And yeah, we definitely suddenly talking an awful lot more about AI than we used to. I also looked it up in Google Trends, which is where Google sort of sees how often search terms are being used. And definitely some point after 2022, 2023, around about then, there's a real spike in interest in the term AI. So, okay, let's dig a little bit deeper here and just see a bit of the history here. So I thought I'd start around about 1985, which is the kind of where the first real relevant results for AI were cropping up relating to artificial intelligence. AI has also been used for artificial insemination, but we'll not worry about that in terms of this. So these are like the computery AI things. And around about the early 80s, the big home computing boom, people were starting to take interest in computers, computers taking over our jobs, a need for broader research into artificial intelligence, neural networks getting mentioned quite early on. And this is the pattern throughout this kind of flat period here. And there's a bit of a jump around about 2005. And 2005 is the Ai Weiwei effect. Searching for AI also gives you this fella, the artist, who was also quite popular around about 2005 to 2010. His name crops up a lot in headlines. It's nothing to do with what we're looking at, so let's move past to what I call the celebrities talking about AI phase, around about 2015. So things are getting serious. As soon as celebrities start talking about AI, you know that something's really happening. When Brian Cox mentions AI, you take notice. And so we're starting to take notice. What's going on? Well, also around 2015, 2016, AI or computing algorithms of some kind or other are starting to beat humans at games. So the big case there with Google winning Go. There was the Deep Blue thing with chess. Poker players being beaten by computers at poker. So this is quite serious, isn't it? If we can be beaten by a computer, well, I mean we're in the end times. Also, it can make pictures. It's not just that it can beat us at games; it can beat us at art potentially. So now we're getting worried. Around about 2020, 2021, 2022, AI will have a bigger impact than fire. Risks are real. It's going to destroy us all. Well, but also there's still positives. You know, it might also be able to detect cancer from farts. So AI has pros as well as cons. But the real jump that we're just reaching around about the end of 2022, that real jump comes when something called ChatGPT gets released to the public. All of this stuff that's going on from 2022 onwards, so the end of 2022, start 2023, is because ordinary people like us suddenly have access to an AI chatbot called ChatGPT, and then other similar chatbots come along as well. So we, or journalists at the very least, can start interacting with these things, can start producing AI representations of Doncaster and things like that. That was one of the headlines I found. And so, yeah, this this release is definitely kind of crucial to this big spike. In fact, if we plot ChatGPT in terms of the Google searches, we can see that it's a pretty direct correlation there. In fact, yeah, the reason that we're all suddenly talking about AI, it looks like from this, well, it's because ChatGPT got released in an open format that anyone could use. No further questions.
But I think we might need to do a little bit of our AI homework now, because we've looked at those kind of headlines and what's going on. But I think we need to work out what we're actually talking about. So let's start with maybe the obvious. Let's start with artificial intelligence. What's that? Is it that robot picture I found of a robot sitting on a bench? Well, artificial intelligence, normally shortened to AI, is basically a broad term for a set of things that involve computers doing things that mimic human intelligence. Or as I like to put it, in quote marks, mimic human intelligence, because what that really means is a bit questionable. And though those searches that Steph's done have proven that it has been being talked about a lot recently, actually the term was coined in the 1950s by a group of American scientists who came together at what they kind of called like a sort of summer project, and sounds very fun. And basically they invented the term artificial intelligence, and ever since people have been questioning if it should be called artificial intelligence. So that is where we've kind of come from with AI as this field. It's a huge field, but that is the starting point. And then we have generative AI, which is the version that most people are talking about. So when we're saying everyone's talking about AI, a lot of what we mean is generative AI specifically, because as I say, artificial intelligence itself is a very broad term that encompasses a lot of different computer kind of processes and things you might be doing with it. But generative AI is using AI-based tools that can generate content. So that is create content based on huge data sets of examples of things, examples of content. And generative AI is what ChatGPT is. It's what other examples of text or image generation are, including the image generation I used to create the image on this slide. This picture of a 1950s housewife talking to a robot who is somehow smoking. In fact, this was one of the attempts to generate a picture to market this session for Festival of Ideas. This one was one of the rejected attempts, unfortunately. I think that human hand is just very freaky and maybe not what we're looking for. But generative AI itself is often based on something called a large language model, which is often shortened to LLM. And that's another term that can be useful to know about when we're looking behind these sort of headlines about AI, because it's often mentioned. And what that means is it's a specific kind of algorithm, a deep learning algorithm, that can learn the characteristics of text. So that's why it's a language model. And examples of this are the one that powers ChatGPT and Copilot, which is some of OpenAI's GPT models, and also Google's Gemini, and there's quite a few other ones. But these are often used via chatbots. So you type text to them and they give you text back, a sort of text reply that's been generated by one of these large language models. And often this kind of keeps going a bit like a conversation. But that's what we end up with. And these large language models are what does it. But how do we have a large language model? Well, that comes from something called a transformer. And a transformer is not the thing we see on the picture here, but a new feature within AI that was developed from a research paper by Google in 2017 that was called Attention is All You Need. And what it means is a transformer is a way of looking at more text at once, essentially. It allows the computer to basically be a bit more like a human in the way that it looks at larger amounts of text and analyze text in a bit more of a nuanced way, a bit more similar to humans and a bit less similar to what previous computers did. But that has made large language models, and therefore made generative AI, a lot better when it's working with text.
So why is everyone talking about AI then? So Steph's told us a bit of the history, and as she went through that, you could see actually there was a narrative throughout which was picking up on the threat of AI, how it's going to take over our jobs, the threat to humanity, how it mimics human intelligence. As Siobhan picked up on, what do we mean by artificial intelligence? It's mimicking human intelligence. It's computers generating images. It's computers playing games. And I'd say that the reason we're all talking about AI is that threat of human intelligence versus artificial intelligence, we may start to think of AI technologies as a way, in some ways, as a creation of life. And with that creation of life, what does that mean to us as humans? And it's why, actually, in a lot of the narrative and the headlines that we see, a lot of the policies that are coming out at the moment about technology, we think about responsible AI and how artificial intelligence may impact our own rights, what it might mean for our copyrights, our intellectual property, for example. What does it mean if we create things? Will we still have the economic right if a computer has generated an image instead? What will it mean for our own moral rights, even like our recognition as the author of that work? How are we protecting that? How are we protecting those human rights that we have? Are these technologies really going to disrupt that? So I feel that a lot of the narrative actually comes from us thinking about, how is this going to impact me? And as part of this, when we're looking at AI, maybe we are seeing this as artificial intelligence holding up that image, that mirror to human intelligence. And maybe sometimes we don't like what that mirror shows us. Maybe it is exacerbating some of the biases we have, the intolerance that we have. Sometimes maybe it's a bit thoughtless, maybe it's a bit dishonest. And some of this we question the technology, but it also makes us question ourselves and what it means to be human. So maybe that's why we're talking about AI. Up on the screen there, I've got an image of myself there eating a fantastic breakfast. Shout out to Victoria Bar in Torry. And I thought for this talk, I'd get an AI generator free pick to create an AI eating a traditional English breakfast. And I am quite sort of reassured a bit by these two images, because I think the breakfast that the AI produced is in no way as good as the breakfast that's been produced over in Torry. So definitely there's that humanity in terms of those cookery skills. I'm not feeling that threat in that same way.
We could continue on this merry little journey about the different reasons we're talking about AI, but we didn't want to. We might have drawn you in with a little bit of hype about AI, but we actually want to look a little bit more broadly, because it feels like we're falling down a bit of a hype hole. Oh, exciting graphics. Bright, exciting graphics here. I think there's this idea of hype and there's also an idea of fear. And both of these come into our ideas about AI and about technology in general. So now we're actually going to have a look at these ideas. I'm going to start by looking at hype and thinking about not only what it means around AI, but what it's meant for technology in the past and how that might help us understand AI. So let's get started with what actually is hype. Why have I chosen hype as something we should be looking at? Well, hype is kind of marketing, isn't it? Hype is trying to get excitement around something. It's advertising something in exciting ways, maybe giving it lots of coverage, maybe lots of praise, in the hope that people will buy it, in the hope people will spend money. So companies often want to generate hype around their products, and technology products are some of those products. But hype is also about trying to make things seem cool. And that might not just be from companies doing it. That might be people who genuinely think the technology is cool and exciting. So they might be saying, this is the next big thing. It's changing my life. Or it will change your life with a company telling you. So hype can come from different places. It can come from companies and be very marketing based, or it can come from people who are genuinely excited about stuff. It also comes from technology companies because they want to be seen as disrupting things. And you might have heard that tech companies often talk about disrupting industries because they want to be seen as doing something that's so new that they're like changing the game. It's so exciting that you've got to try it. You've got to spend money on it. And that's another way we can kind of view technology and technology change. It's through these ideas of this sort of hype. And there's lots of things around this. For example, the Gartner hype cycle, which is basically this kind of cycle of thing that comes out every year, which sort of suggests what technologies people are going to be excited about that year and at what level on a scale of hype. So is it like people are really, it's new and exciting, or have people got a bit bored of it now? I think there's a plateau of like indifference or something similar like that on it. And this is one way that people try and track interest in technology. However, like much or not, it actually tells us very much about it. And another example of hype technology was the dot-com bubble from the late 90s, in which, excitement about the World Wide Web meant that people poured loads of money into basically websites, and then it turned out that they didn't have quite as much money they were going to be making as it seemed. So there's lots of hype around that. But to explore this idea a bit more, I thought I'd Google most overhyped tech and maybe try and find some articles about it. And Google just gave me the answer right away. Most overhyped tech, generative AI, apparently. You'll notice this is just grabbed from an article. It's not actually Google's new AI generation feature that's been in the news recently because it keeps giving really bad answers. This is just Google grabbing a bit of an article and saying it's generative AI. Sorted, done. Again, like Steph said, case closed. Let's end the talk now. Or maybe let's have a think about other overhyped technologies and what's kind of happened with them. So I thought I'd start with segways. Don't know if anyone remembers segways or has been on one. I've never been on a Segway. I don't see them much in my daily life anymore. They were talked about quite a bit at different points. You do still see them around occasionally, but they're a technology that perhaps we don't see in the street, like this image of everyone just segwaying around. We've got technology like virtual reality and augmented reality, and the metaverse, and these concepts that were talked about again in the 2010s. There was just everything was all, will everything be in virtual reality now? And it seemed very exciting and new. But again, the world hasn't got into virtual reality yet. I think some reason because everything's still quite expensive. It's quite hard for people to engage with that at the moment. But that's another technology that has been very hyped. We've got the blockchain and cryptocurrency, which might be terms you're just thinking, those are weird words that I'm vaguely aware of, or maybe you're quite interested in it. But those are also technologies that came about with a lot of hype and a lot of promise, and maybe we've not seen much of a change in our lives due to them yet. And that's not to say that any of these technologies might make a difference, even segways, because my fourth example is a QR code. And QR codes were one of these overhyped, not going anywhere technologies. I found a lovely Time magazine article from 2017 that listed QR codes as one of sort of the biggest tech failures. They were hyped and they never went anywhere. And then 2020 came and QR codes got a new lease of life when we didn't want to touch things. And QR codes, still now, I see them in a lot of places. They've actually kind of become more of a technology than they had the first time around, because they suddenly had a need for them. So we can't necessarily say that a hype won't get a technology somewhere, but it might take a little longer than the hype wants it to get there. And hype isn't something new either. I may have invented this piece of medieval clickbait in which the Bayeux Tapestry actually had some, you won't believe this one technology that will change the world. But we've always been hyping new things. When the printing press came around, people would have been like, wow, this is going to change everything. And I suppose it did, didn't it? So maybe that hype was right. But hype is something that we will experience, and it's existed as long as technology has. And some technologies, they have actually really taken off, as well as the ones that haven't.
Yeah. So is it all a sales pitch? Is everything that we're seeing spin? I mean, we've all had like disappointing toys in our life that, okay, they might not have been missold exactly, but they didn't look as shiny and exciting as they did when we first encountered them in the shop and thought, oh yes, that's going to be revolutionary. And it's not, it's just a bit of plastic that gets kicked around the floor. What are we being sold? What are we getting? I think there's a sense of timing that's often involved in all of this, and whether people need a solution to something. They genuinely need something to add to a particular scenario. I mean, take television. So television came out. It sort of slowly got released across the country, and when you're faced with a new technology like that, you've got to decide whether you're going to participate in that technology. Maybe you need a bit of hype to get built around that technology. Maybe you need a bit of anecdote saying, oh yeah, no, I saw a television program and it was good. Maybe you need a big occasion like a coronation to get people buying television sets so that they don't miss out on something. So okay, then we need to decide what television we're getting, and again, that might be kind of status choice. We might want to get a really swish television, or we might want to just get one that's going to be reliable. Again, we might need a bit of hype to tell us about that. We might very least need some sort of review mechanism to tell us about those things. We might need a television cabinet in the corner of our room. It's going to transform our room, transform the way that we have our houses laid out. So that's a new piece of furniture that I've got to go and buy. I need the Radio Times to tell me what's going to be on. So a whole new avenue of publishing that's giving me listings for television programs. I might need a binder to put all my back issues the Radio Times in, or I might not. Maybe that's just selling me a little bit too much, and that's not going to be a transformative technology in quite the same way. Probably going to need a VHS machine or a Betamax machine. Again, I've got to make choices between different technologies. So all these things have a degree of hype around them. We see hype in a lot of things, sometimes to try and encourage us to engage more with the technology. So, for instance, 3D. How many times has the film industry tried to persuade us to watch films in 3D? You know, then we had stuff in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, different waves of this. They tried it again in the early 2000s as well. And we go along and we see things sticking out of the screen and we think, oh, that's kind of swish. And then we get bored of it very quickly. And so this cycle of 3D comes and goes, rinse and repeat. Rinse and repeat. You can get AI in washing machines now. And I don't know, maybe there's a use for AI in a washing machine, or maybe actually that's just something else to go wrong in a washing machine. Maybe it's designed to just sell more washing machines further down the line. I'm not sure. But we love technology, to be honest, don't we? The technology aspect of it is like a really big part of how we sort of exist in society almost. We get lured in by new technology. Businesses especially can be feeling kind of really weak, really sort of on edge unless they've got the latest technology. It's almost a status thing, isn't it? I've got a screenshot here of, I've got a few screenshots. One of them, from The Simpsons, being lured in to a technology that other people might have got, or might be something that somewhere else might be more interested in. So suddenly we're interested. Suddenly we want to get a bit of that technology. Got a clip here from Monty Python of a hospital administrator coming around, really excited to see the machine that goes ping, because the machine that goes ping is very expensive. Whether it's the most useful piece of equipment in that hospital doesn't really matter. What matters is the machine that goes ping. It's the status. It's the lure of technology. It's almost an idea of technological solutionism. I mean, sometimes new technologies like this are really useful. Sometimes they do revolutionize our life, like television. Sometimes, like microwaves were going to be a massive life-changing event in the 80s. And they didn't become quite as big an impact as they might have initially appeared, but they are really useful for defrosting stuff. Sometimes technologies are less useful. Sometimes it's almost as if there are other social approaches that we could take, different routes we could take, rather than the technological solution that's presented to us. Like at the moment, a lot of supermarkets are starting to padlock their cheeses in security tags. That's a technological solution to a problem of growing cheese theft. Now, maybe the answer is to tag them up. Maybe there's a social answer. Maybe there's an economic answer out there, a political answer that is not being taken, that might be a slightly more difficult solution, or just not as flashy a solution, perhaps. Sometimes as well, technology is just there to mislead. They're there to be just pure snake oil, essentially. This screenshot I've got in the bottom right here from Carry On Loving in 1970. This elaborate, high-tech, whizzy supercomputer exists to provide dating advice, to match people up with their potential partners, but it's actually just Hattie Jakes behind a wall shoving a piece of card through a little letterbox. And maybe a lot of this technology is just Hattie Jakes behind a wall. Maybe AI is just Hattie Jakes behind a wall.
So we've looked there into hype, and maybe some of it is that smoke and mirrors, some of it is that marketing that we get. But one of the things that I wanted to consider was when we go from hype to mass adoption and maybe change. So to begin with, there might be some barriers to this change, which both Siobhan and Steph have touched on. Steph was talking about television. Now, to begin with, that meant you had to buy a television, you had to have an aerial to connect it. Maybe you had to get a recording device as well. Maybe you got a Betamax, maybe a different recorder that became more popular after. The same with the QR codes. Siobhan mentioned to begin with, QR codes, they weren't adopted. It was a big hype. But then actually, maybe as we all started to get a phone in our pocket that had a camera on it that was attached to the internet, that QR code had a new lease of life. We could access it and that's what I think with recent changes and adoptions in technologies is as they become more accessible, because maybe we've got the hardware or maybe we've now got the skills, that's when we can maybe see more about the changes, that it goes beyond hype, that it starts to really change the way we function as a society, changes those jobs that we do, the way that we live. So if we think about things in terms of technologies and that enable us to use it, we might look at the internet, for example. Might not have seemed as accessible to begin with, but when you got a search engine, Ask Jeeves, you could just put your question in and it would link you through to information. Google, for example, made it easier for us to do that. And the same has happened with some of these generative AI technologies. With ChatGPT, it was easy accessible to all of us. And I do acknowledge not all of us. We may not have the data, we may not have the technology. You know, there is a level of privilege with any digital technology before it reaches the masses, but much more now we have that ability to interact with these smart technologies or smart washers. They're built in. Maybe the technologies we already had the potential to be smart, our TV. Just up on the screen, I got Copilot to create some images for me of a smart home. I had a bit of fun with this when we see the cone shaped thing. That was I added a prompt of a smart pet feeder, and then it started putting pets in my images and a pet feeder in strange places. Maybe I put in a smart mirror, a smart recipe generator, because it was prompting me to do that. But when we look at this, these technologies have become immersed in the technologies that we use, so they're easily accessible to us. And with that, that may start to move us beyond hype to really think about that change. So maybe, for example, I talked about the smartphone. That enabled us to have a personal computer in our pocket. It enabled us to do a lot of different things with that technology on the go. And now maybe generative AI is enabling us to have our own digital artist, our own digital author, or digital friend in our pocket. You know, the way my mum talks to Alexa, I would say that is her digital companion. So we maybe start to rely on these things to do our bidding, to change how we interact with things. We may think of them as a friend, but we may also think of them as our digital foe. And actually, as these technologies start to become more accessible to us, with that inevitably there may be some disruption, there may be some change, and with that there may also come those anxieties about, well, what does this mean for us, for society, for me?
Yeah, we start to see the flip side of hype, which is fear. I've got the quote here from Arthur C. Clarke about any sufficiently advanced technology being indistinguishable from magic. New technology can be something terrifying for a multitude of different ways. Let's look at a technology. So photography. I've got some snaps from the family archive here, starting with this guy. He was a bit of a wrong 'un. He had a prison photograph there. Photography being used to document the human image in a way that was never possible before that point. Documenting the image, but also maybe documenting our soul, capturing our soul. Some people worried about that. But my family didn't seem to worry about that. They were getting their photos taken left, right, and center. But photography, like television that I was mentioning earlier, hugely transformative technology. And with that transformation comes a degree of good change, positive change, but also a degree of negative change in some cases. We've got photographs here taken in studios, having your portrait taken. Now that's a big new avenue that you can pursue if you are from a working class background. You might never have dreamt of getting your portrait painted because that's quite expensive, but having a photograph taken, a bit cheaper. Now, if you're a portrait painter, you might be starting to wonder about whether you're going to be out of a job now because photography is stealing your work. And then as the camera becomes something that normal people actually have, like a box brownie and other personal cameras, we get to see the photography comes out of the studio and into normal people's hands. And again, if you've set up your photographic studio, you're probably starting to worry now that you're not going to have any work either. So, but at the same time, the other side of the coin, we've got a technology that's allowing us to document social history like never before. Almost becomes like a tool for improving our memory in a way as well. It sort of allows us to look back at points in time and remember certain things. It becomes this huge ability, democratizes creativity. So some people get scared of that sort of stuff, that democratization effect. But also these new literacies that we start to build in with photography. So photography becomes a part of journalism. And we have this idea that the camera never lies, which we now know not to be true. For years, people have doctored photos. Now we have AI generating photographic quality images. And again, that technology, the ability to create a fake photo, used to be quite hard work to create a fake photo. You need to probably some sort of studio in order to do it. Now, any of us can generate a fake image really easily. So again, that's something else for us to fear. And then you've got ownership questions, intellectual property. AI is eating all these images, using them to generate new images. Who owns those images? If you are somebody who's made a living from generating photographs of whatever kind, well, that's going to be a bit of a challenge to your livelihood. And again, this is nothing new. This, as we see with that whole photographic avenue, but also in terms of sound. I've got a mellotron here. That's a kind of early synthesizer kind of instrument. Works with reels of tape, with recordings of other instruments. Means that if you had enough money to buy a mellotron, you didn't have to hire an orchestra because you could just press a button and have the sound of the instruments from an orchestra. This is something that became a bit of a livelihood threat for orchestras in some cases. You look at the Eurovision Song Contest, used to have a live orchestra. Don't anymore, because you could just have a backing tape. So this idea of being able to synthesize, it's not a new idea, but it's something that we're starting to see in a new avenue, in new ways with AI technology. Also, that idea of AI eating other people's intellectual property is not a new idea and crosses over with this musical landscape. We've been sampling for a long time now. A lot of popular music uses samples. some old music that uses samples. I've got a picture of Tchaikovsky on this screen, 1812 Overture. The bit at the end, especially, is a great big work of plunderphonics. It's sampling folk songs and national anthems and having them fight with each other. So stealing or borrowing or appropriating other people's music is, again, nothing new. It's something that we've had to deal with. But there's a fear around what's going on there. There's a fear about whether your rights are being recognised as an author of a work. These fears are often valid. They're also sometimes used as a weapon. Fear can be used as a weapon. I've got a load of Gothic novels here, all talking about fear. They're talking about fear as a means of control, essentially. And fear can also be used to stir up panic. Great big willful misunderstandings almost. A lot of people with vested interests will use fear almost as a distraction technique against maybe bigger issues. Look out for it at the moment. We're in a general election campaign. There will be a lot of use of fear as a distraction technique. But sometimes we're right to fear. Sometimes technology can be used in a manipulative way. We've seen that with photography. We've seen that in a lot of cases already. So we've got to be wary, and we've also got to be critical. We've got to be thinking critically about everything we're seeing here. I mean, the word Luddite, now there's a loaded term. It's often used disparagingly these days, isn't it? Luddite is somebody who fears technology and technological change. But the real Luddites, the Ned Ludd followers, the whole campaign around what gave us the term Luddite, these were skilled labourers trying to defend their profession, keep sort of fair pay, in the face of what was essentially a huge piece of social engineering. The Industrial Revolution was a massive program of, well, was it technological advancement? Some of it was, but some of it was just ways to pay people less. There's a sense, I guess, of control, of manipulation as part of all this change, perhaps. I don't know.
So Steph's picked up on there how we may fear change as maybe it's used as control in terms of the technology and the narratives that are presented to us. Maybe there's been that mass adoption and misuse of some of our creative outputs. But I think, to me, when I'm thinking about fear, ultimately, I'm thinking about, what about me? It goes back to that argument of artificial intelligence mimicking human intelligence. So I start to think, what does this technology mean for me, for example, at work? So there's a picture of the Sir Duncan Rice Library where I work. I'm a librarian. A lot of the things that are coming out of, well, new technologies like the internet and now generative AI, it's about access to information. It's now about generation of information. So as someone who works as an information professional, I might be thinking, what does this mean for me? I mean, Google initially came along and said its role was to organize the world's information. It still has that as a mission. Well, actually, to me as a librarian, that's my job, is to organize the world's information. But we've weathered, end user searching in terms of working as a librarian. My role has maybe changed from being the person who found the information to actually being the educator who helped you find that information, or now helping you develop those critical skills to deal with that information. But there still is that level of, what will this mean in terms of me for work? The other area might be, what might this mean for me at home? I've got a picture there of my bookcase. I like to read a book. That's how I like to spend my evenings. Maybe now I'm worried, though, am I reading a book that's been written by a human, or has that just been generated by a computer? And I don't know how I feel about that. Certainly, am I not going to have physical books anymore? Is it all just going to be digital? And what does that mean for how I interact for my home life? Another thing might be leisure. I love got a picture there of the Kelvin Grove Museum. I love going to Kelvin Grove, but actually with these new technologies, what about VR, immersive technologies? Does that mean that now I no longer go to Kelvin Grove? I have to buy a headset. I have to have a VR headset. That means I have to buy that hardware to be able to interact in that way. So that might be a fear of loss, of going to those communal spaces, of meeting other people and enjoying art together. And then finally, I've got a picture there at the bottom of my family, my wonderful husband. Currently, me and my husband, we live between York and Aberdeen, so we're not always in the same place. So I'm thinking about, well, what do these technologies mean for how I interact with my husband? I like to write love letters to my husband, longhand prose. Does this mean now, actually, a computer's going to generate them? Is there no care in that? Is his computer AI going to generate the messages to me and I'm going to generate them using AI? So basically, our AI versions are just talking to each other and we're not talking to each other. This is just, a whole world of fear that I'm kind of opening that box on. So I would say a lot of this fear really comes back to, what does this mean for me? How is it going to change what I do? How does it change how I feel about myself?
What does that mean more broadly then for our attitudes to technological change? Because, we've had a look at some of these ideas of fear and we've had a look at personal fear reactions to technology. What does that mean more generally? So, what I want to think about is how fear, there's another side to that coin sometimes in terms of technology, and that's overconfidence. So sometimes you have some people who are very fearful and some people who are very overconfident, and they both come from quite similar places, which might be built out of some of this fear and hype, some of these ideas, and also maybe a bit of a lack of knowledge. And not often on purpose, often it's just because new technologies, we don't know that much about them. But a little bit of knowledge can often change people's ideas in different directions. And that might be removing some of that fear. It might be removing some of that hype. It might be completely changing someone's opinion and they used to have lots of hype and now they're very fearful of it. There's lots of change that can happen, but often it's about learning a bit more about something or new developments happening which uncover new things for you. It can also be about whether you have access to it and whether you could have a go or not. If you can't access something, you often have a reaction to it that is quite extreme because you can't have a go and perhaps get a more temperate opinion. And people's viewpoints change over time as well. Individual people, but groups of people too. And it's not linear and it's not the same for any person. Maybe you heard some of Susan's fears and you thought those are silly fears, but you've got your own fears. Or maybe you really agreed with her fears. So we all have quite different trajectories. And I'm quite interested in that. And I thought it'd be quite interesting to have a think about some imagined different trajectories people might have. And I've picked out kind of 4 different levels we might have. So we could have some fear, we could have some uncertainty around technology where we're a bit like, oh, I'm not that sure, maybe using it a bit. Then we've got use where you just kind of use it, haven't maybe got a huge opinion about it. And then maybe we've got overconfidence where you kind of use it without thinking, maybe. You're so committed to this technology, you don't always think about it. And these trajectories can be quite different. So these are some imagined different people in the different lines. And over time, their attitudes might change. And people might think of this as like a solid thing, people moving either from fear to just using it, or people perhaps getting rid of that overconfidence, but it can be quite varied. And I think sometimes it's useful to consider technologies and how that works. So, for example, Facebook. Facebook was originally developed specifically for college students in the US and then was opened up more widely. So lots of people perhaps were uncertain about it initially and then started using it, whereas other people perhaps got on board very quickly. Maybe their college friends were using it too, and then their opinion might have changed. Social media sites, people often, their opinions change depending what other people are doing on them. But in the case of Facebook, things like the Cambridge Analytica scandal, which was happening in the 2010s and lots of the details came out in about 2018, revealed that lots of Facebook data was then being used to influence things like elections and political decisions. And people gained a lot of distrust in Facebook, and lots of people stopped using it, in fact, because they're worried about what happened to their data. Whereas other people, they weren't worried about that. They continued to use it. And so opinions changed quite a lot about who was actually using it. And we might not understand other people's journeys. Maybe you do or don't use Facebook or any other technology we're talking about. And maybe other people you know do use different ones to you. Maybe you worry about what your relatives or friends are doing online or on technology because they're doing different things to you. They might have quite different understandings of it or lack of understanding. They might know different ethical considerations, or they might not be bothered about those. And all of our kind of transformative change and what technology does in the world comes out of these really complex situations in which everyone's at different levels and they change their ideas. And adoption has to happen in spite of all these different attitudes. So sometimes it's healthy to have some of this fear, and sometimes some of the fear is overcome because we need to use the benefits. So maybe the fear of something like photography, for example, might be overcome because actually it was really good for us to save those memories. And the fact that Steph can see family members from so long ago suggests there were some benefits to photography, even if there were fears as well, because that's pretty cool. But it can be hard to see that. So real transformation often needs people to see beyond the immediate and to consider the future, whatever that might mean.
So let's now look at that transformation. We've had a look at the hype, those new technologies as they come into our knowledge and how they might be sold in different ways. We've then talked about how that might result in mass adoption and change, or how that also results in fear. But as Siobhan was picking up on then, let's now think about transformation. How do we go to maybe an imagining a different future, or an AI-enabled future or disrupted future? So I just wanted to think about how we might imagine the future. So actually, when we're thinking about the future, we may need to challenge some of our assumptions that might be rooted in some of these negative bias, these worst case scenarios. Maybe they're driven by fear. What we need to do is challenge some of that so that maybe we can view the world in a different way, influence and negotiate, and have a future that really is beneficial to both artificial and human intelligence. So let's have a look at changing those narratives. If I start off first by thinking of more of that dystopian, AI disrupted future, and I've asked AI to generate that dystopian future for me here. So I'm not going to say it's the most creative ever. It's just based on predictions and what the most likely scenario might be. But in this future, this disrupted idea, AI rules over our aspects of life. We haven't got that control. It's all going towards the rich. Those inequalities continue to grow. We start to lose our jobs, that fear that we've discussed throughout this. We lose that sense of community, and our nature is disrupted because of the sustainability issues that come with this AI. We've lost all our privacy and our human rights, and that idea of freedom is a distant memory. We're lost in this digital noise. So this is painting quite a drab and depressing future, I feel, for AI. So maybe we need to flip that narrative. So if we look at this more as a utopian or an AI-enabled future, once again, generated by AI, we might turn that round. So maybe this is about the potential of human and machine working together. It's about us looking at those inequalities and addressing them, looking at that balance between work and leisure, thinking about how the impacts on technology on environment could work in a beneficial way. It's about cherishing what it means to be human, to have our human rights, to have our privacy, and about connecting with people. So I'd say that we probably need to look at both sides of our dystopian, utopian future, but actually really starting to drill into this in a critical way to think, what is it that we want from our technology enhanced future, our AI enabled future? How do we want to influence responsible use of these technologies that ensure us to be cherished as human beings, and also for our creativity to be continued to be respected? We need to think about both these things. So if we imagine that, maybe we can influence how these technologies are adopted, and we have a bit more control over that transformation.
So this utopian notion of technology is something we've seen before. And I just want to go back to the days of the early days of the World Wide Web, the 90s, the early 2000s. And to be honest, also to some extent, before the World Wide Web, the earlier internet, it was very idealistic. A lovely Alta Vista view of the background there, but it was very much a kind of paradise, an information commons ideal, where ideas of copyright, property were old hat. We were starting a new society, a kind of Wild West virtual world, a kind of almost like an anarchy, but a nice anarchy. One of the sort of children of this model that is very famous and very well used, one of the most popular sites on the internet, is Wikipedia. Wikipedia is essentially built on this kind of anarchist, utopianist model of a kind of collective information commons work. Anyone can edit it. We're going to collate all human knowledge into one space. It's going to be brilliant. And that works a treat, but not everything did, and a lot of those ideals, they were a bit naive. And you think about file sharing, for instance. We were file sharing because property is theft. Let's share this stuff and plow our brave new world. But capitalism couldn't allow that to continue. And the internet is now a very different place to what we were seeing in the 90s and 2000s. A lot of big business got involved. But it isn't all down to big business. Some of it's on us as well. It's not difficult to make a website, but it's not straightforward either. There are complexities to making a website. And so when the easier things came along, we snapped them up. So blogs are easier technology than making a website. And blogging platforms got started up, and we went for them. And social media is even easier. To have a post on Twitter, you could just text Twitter. It was very straightforward. But of course, these are big businesses that we're putting our content into, whereas before, a website might be owned by us potentially. So we're making choices there to some extent. We are also shaped somewhat by these technologies. So Facebook, for instance, shapes our behavior. We've seen, Siobhan mentioned some of the ways that Facebook managed to shape our behavior with the Cambridge Analytica stuff, but also just something as simple as not having to think about creating a cool avatar or a cool screen name, because the whole Facebook model was you use your real name, you use a photo of you, and that's it. Very straightforward. And we lapped it up. We made those choices that were made in the early days have shaped how we interact with technology, and that technology has shaped us and shaped the world around us. Look, there's a phone in my hands. So, this idea as well, nothing is free, actually. Despite what we thought when we were picking the daisies along the information superhighway, all that, file sharing and what have you, just made Spotify the all-powerful force in music, and actually a lot of the music industry and record shops just fell by the wayside as part of that as much as anything else. We shape our environment, our environment shapes us. And that's true of AI as well. Here I've got a picture of a cat. The internet is made of pictures of cats, and AI is made of the internet. So if you were to do an image search for the word cat, you get a lot of cats. Probably one of the image searches that fetches the most results. But increasingly, a lot of the cats on the internet have been generated by AI. People like playing with AI image generators, and cats are going to get spewed out of it. So now AI is relying on the internet to learn from. So the more AI content is on the internet, the more AI is kind of eating itself. It's weeing in its own well almost. And it's a bit like a photocopy of a photocopy, and that's all well and good. But if you think about a photocopy of a photocopy, well, the more AI is eating its own content, the more it becomes a copy of itself. And if you keep photocopying, you keep copying, well, eventually you end up with a blank sheet of paper. And that is the future of the internet if we're not careful.
And on that joyous note, let's consider what that might mean for AI then. Where are we at as we get to the end of this talk? We have a lot to weigh up on the AI scales that I've carefully made on this slide, because there are a lot of things we have to consider. There are lots of ethical issues, and we've also got to consider all the use cases and useful things and positive stuff that people might see around AI. And we've also, not even on the AI scales, there's quite a lot of things like misinformation around AI and confusion that we also have to deal with. In terms of some of those ethical issues that we have to consider, we've mentioned quite a few of them already today. We've mentioned things like the copyright issues that come up around the content that goes in and trains AI, but also the content that comes out of AI. Ideas around intellectual property and who owns the content. And if some generative AI makes content that's a bit similar to the work you make, can you do something about that? If it seems to be affecting your ability to make content that looks like your style, can you do things about that? There's issues around privacy, for example, that lots of people have questions around, and what information we put in and what generative AI tools might be using about anything we put into them. There's also questions on the quality of content that goes into generative AI, and comes out of it. That idea that Steph was talking about what sort of rubbish do we keep getting if we're training it on the rubbish it makes, things like that. There's big questions around ideas of plagiarism and ideas like academic integrity and what that comes from. There's also lots of questions on the climate impact of generative AI because of the fact that it uses a lot of computing power. And it's not that much research has actually been done into this. It's research that's ongoing. And there's also about the sort of human labor elements of it. There's various facets of that, from ideas about automation and them taking jobs and skills away from people, because you can just get an AI to do it, to the fact that real people have to label up the data sets that generative AI uses. And those people are often doing very repetitive jobs and not treated like the important tech workers they are. So there's all sorts of big ethical issues. It would be many, many talks to get through this. And in fact, we're probably overrunning because I'm telling you about these ones now. So there's so much we can consider. And there's also a lot of stuff around the use cases of generative AI, but it's quite tricky to look at because lots of current research and work that uses AI to do it and can make a bigger impact on big questions around things like healthcare and climate, and things like that aren't using generative AI. They're using other forms of AI because there's lots of other bits around AI that aren't being as hyped about at the moment in the same way. Things that can predict using lots of data, and they're really good. They can do things like predict when crops will be successful or fail, which will help us keep the world fed. But those aren't all using generative AI because generative AI is quite new and there's often it's unclear what impacts it's going to have. There are groups of researchers who are working on areas to do with using the technology like those large language models I mentioned at the start, to try and do things with scientific discovery instead. I found a study that's going on with an international team of scientists at the University of Cambridge where they're trying to go for the similar kind of approach to generative AI to see if they can actually model stuff around things like the Earth's climate using knowledge we already have and getting it to kind of generate new stuff that they can investigate. So we have got stuff, but we don't really know lots of these things. It's really hard to weigh up stuff on the AI scales. And there's lots of floating misinformation and confusion as well. And then we have the other problem around AI. And that is that AI needs lots of data. And a lot of that's been facilitated by previous technological change like smartphones and the internet and smart devices and social media, meaning we have lots of data about us. But, researchers have started to suggest we might actually run out of data for generative AI to use. And what that would mean is they couldn't get any better. There's no way of training them further. So will generative AI have to change in the future? Does that mean that actually the technology is not actually a long-lasting, always improving technology, but at some point we're going to perhaps have to change it? And we don't know that yet. It's being researched. All these things are very new. And to come back to our question of our talk, one of the reasons we're talking about AI is because we don't know that much about it. Like in terms of what impact it will have, lots of people who are working on it know what it does and how it works, but they don't always know what's going to come next and how we're going to adapt it. So, what does that mean for our hype and fear? Is the landscape actually something much more complex? Are we going to see that these ideas of hype and fear are going to continue to cycle around? But we need to decide, as Susan was talking about, as Steph was talking about with the internet, we need to decide what we think is important around AI and around any technological change. And we have to push for what that change we think it should be and look for ways that we can influence it. And some of that's our behavior. If we think generative AI should only be used in certain ways, that's the only ways we should use it in. If you think it really shouldn't be used at all, don't use it. If you think it should be used lots, use it lots maybe. There's different things, but also what impact you might be able to have, keeping informed, trying to find information. There's all sorts of things we can do. So I think what we can return to, and my parting message for the talk is just to you afterwards, reflect on maybe where you feel you are on any sort of scale thinking about AI. And is that likely to change? I don't know. Maybe you want it to change. Maybe you want to read more about it. Maybe you want to read more about it so you can ensure you're nicely informed. Maybe that information might change your mind. But what we've hoped to do is just to have a think about where our hype and our fear around technology comes from and how we might use that to think about AI going forward, given that it's so new and so talked about at the moment. So thank you very much for listening. Sorry we overran a little bit there. Just so much to talk about.